Now, we talked earlier about how in this Gilded Age, during this time period, there were the 1% who were making huge profits, right? They were creating monopolies, they were creating these large trust organizations and making huge profits, right? And part of the reason why they were able to do that was because they were working in conjunction with politicians, okay? And so now let's talk a little bit about political corruption that was going on during the Gilded Age. So many of these politicians had personal interests in big business. They may be on the payroll of a certain business, right? They're getting paid like a check, a salary from a certain business, right? Or maybe they own stocks in a business, right? And because they have a personal interest, they are going to allow these corporations to do whatever they want so that they can increase profits. And the politicians are basically getting paid for it, right? Because they have a stake in the business, a personal stake in the business. All right, let's talk about an example of this. The example of Credit Mobilier. Okay, so one of the major railroad companies at the time was called Union Pacific, the Union Pacific Railroad, right? And within the Union Pacific Railroad, they had a bunch of stockholders, but some of the main stockholders came together. They came up with an idea. They said, hey, you know what? Let's go ahead and create a company, and then we'll make contracts with that company to do certain jobs, and we'll pay that company a huge amount of money, and we'll get all that money, right? We'll pay them way more than what they deserve, okay? And so they did that. And the name of the company that they created was Credit Mobilier, okay? So these certain stockholders within the Union Pacific Railroad created another company, and they're gonna end up paying themselves through huge contracts, right? And where's that money coming from? It's coming from the federal government, right? A lot of it's going to come from the federal government. Because why? The federal government was subsidizing the railroads in some cases, right? Sometimes the railroads came from personal capital, private capital, but then sometimes the capital came from the federal government. In this case, you have the government subsidizing the Union Pacific Railroad, and that money, they're going to take that money coming from the government, and they're going to write contracts with themselves for the separate company that they created, and they're going to pay themselves huge amounts of money, and basically they're just taking money from the government and getting rich. Okay, so this came out. It becomes well known that Credit Mobilier is this huge scam by the Union Pacific Railroad or certain stockholders within the company. And they're not alone. There's also politicians who knew that this was going on. Okay, politicians knew what was going on, and they let it go because why? They owned stock in the Union Pacific Railroad. Okay, so they're getting paid, right? The more profits they get, the more profits that the railroad gets, the more the politicians get paid. So it's huge. It's huge. It's great for them, right? But they got exposed, and their reputations got greatly damaged because they were known as being, corrupt politicians. Now, although there was massive corruption going on, and politicians sometimes were part of that corruption during the Gilded Age, the federal government did pass a number of acts and created agencies to try to stop political corruption and the corruption of big business, okay? So let's talk about a couple examples of that. First, we have the Civil Service Act of 1883. The Civil Service Act basically created a civil service exam for certain federal jobs, okay? So basically, if you want to get that job, you have to pass the civil service exam, okay? And the reason why this was being done is because before, politicians would just give government jobs to individuals who supported them while they were campaigning for office, okay? And when I mean support, when I talk about support, I'm talking about like financial support, right? So if somebody gave them money for their campaign, then they could in return get a federal job later, okay? That's political corruption, and the Civil Service Act looked to terminate that by forcing individuals to take an exam. So they're not just going to be given a job for donating to somebody's campaign, but that is also going to result in big business stepping in and kind of filling that void. So now campaign contributions are going to start coming from big business, and so that's gonna give big business heavy influence on politicians. So there's still that political corruption, but the civil service exam is trying to stem some of the political corruption that was going on at the time. The federal government also created the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, in 1887. Now, this relates to the railroads again. Okay, remember we were talking about the railroads and how corrupt they were. Well, there were a number of small farmers who were upset with the railroads because the railroads charged them so much money to transport their produce, and the railroads also owned a number of storage facilities where that produce was held until it was transported. So small farmers felt like they were getting charged huge prices by the railroad companies to store and transport their goods. Okay, now the ICC was created to step in and investigate the railroad companies to see if they were charging too much to small farmers while giving better deals or better prices to larger businesses. But still, the ICC could only sue the railroad companies. They couldn't actually regulate them. They couldn't pass laws and say, hey, you have to charge a certain price to everybody, not just big business. You know, the small farmers get to pay the same price as the bigger businesses. They don't get special privileges, okay? So the ICC couldn't do that. They couldn't regulate the railroad companies. And so you have organizations of small farmers such as the Patrons of Husbandry, also known as the Grange. This is just an organization of small farmers throughout the country who came together to try to force state governments to create regulation agencies for the railroads so they could create reasonable prices for storing and transporting goods, right, for the small farmers, right? So that's what the Grange was trying to accomplish. And then finally, there's the Sherman Antitrust Act, okay? The Sherman Antitrust Act was meant to break up monopolies, okay? Like the big trusts we were talking about earlier, like Standard Oil. The Sherman Antitrust Act was supposed to break apart any of these large trusts that were restricting competition, right? Or limiting competition. Okay, so if there's a big company that has a monopoly in a certain industry and there's no real competition there, the Sherman Antitrust Act could be used to break apart that large company into several different companies. But the Sherman Antitrust Act will not actually be used for those purposes until a couple of decades later. So the robber barons, the 1%, the wealthy monopoly owners are going to basically have their way for another couple of decades.